Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second Saturday program this month. I really appreciate everyone taking the time to come join us on this gorgeous spring day. I hope it's as nice where you are as it is where I am. It's been sunny. I've been out in the garden all morning, but I'm also really excited to be here today with our guest, Bill Haltom. So I'm going to go ahead. I'll make some announcements at the end, so I hope you can stick around. But Bill Haltom is joining us from Memphis, Tennessee, where he lives with his wife and his beagles, I believe, 2 beagles. Mm-hmm. He is an author and a humorist, has been writing in newspapers and magazines for several decades. And this is it your 6th book?
This is actually my 8th book, as a matter of fact.
8th book, I apologize. So,
but 2 of them didn't sell at all, so go ahead.
The book today that we are discussing is Why Can't Mother Vote? Joseph Hanover and the Unfinished Business of Democracy. We will tell you how you can get your own copy at the end. And after you hear Bill talk about it, I am certain that you are going to want your own copy. So without further ado, I'm going to let Bill tell you more about himself and tell you the riveting story about the passage of the 19th Amendment.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. I really am thrilled to be here. By my count, this is the 25th Zoom presentation or webinar presentation that I have made in the past year to tell you the story about Joe Hanover from Tennessee, originally from Poland, from Tennessee, and this suffragette who played an incredible role in the passage of the 19th Amendment in August of 1920, just a little over 100 years ago. But while I've done 24 previous presentations, I want to tell you this. To speak to a program put together by the Alice Paul Institute means more to me than all the other presentations, and I'll tell you why. There's a great connection between the story I'm going to tell you today and Alice Paul. The story about Joe Hanover, this suffragette who helped lead the fight for the ratification of the 19th Amendment in the state of Tennessee, making it a part of the Constitution of the United States of America. Alice Paul made this happen. She gave the opportunity because, as you all know, Alice Paul fought for the 19th Amendment for years, beginning in 1913, the day that, actually before then, but in 1913, the day Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as president. She led a march in Washington in favor of the proposed constitutional amendment. Woodrow Wilson was still not supportive. The years went by. In 1917, at his second inauguration, she led a protest every day for well over a year. She was arrested 7 times. But she had a great connection to Tennessee, and a book I want to recommend in addition to my book. If you get a chance, read The Perfect 36, Tennessee Delivers Women's Suffrage. You can order it on Amazon and also online, other sources. This is a book that was published by my dear friend Paula Casey. Paula is a great historian in Tennessee. She's the founder of the Tennessee Women's Heritage Trail, which you can walk someday across the state of Tennessee and see where these figures were. And she writes in this book about the connection between Alice Paul and the state of Tennessee, particularly a woman named Sue Shelton White. You see, Alice Paul, as you know, was chairman of the National Women's Party. And although she did not come to Tennessee in 1920 for the vote, the final vote on the ratification of the 19th Amendment, she was in contact with Sue Shelton White from Jackson, Tennessee, who was the state chairman of the National Women's Party, the Tennessee state chairman. And from that Washington command post, Alice Paul helped make what happened that I'm going to tell you about in just a minute, what happened in August of 1920. But the story I want to share with you today about this man, about Joe Hanover, does not begin in Washington, D.C. It does not begin in New Jersey. It does not begin anywhere in the United States of America. This story begins in Pultusk, Poland. The story begins in Pultusk, Poland in 1889, because in 1889, Joe Hanover, the 3rd son of Esther and Wolf Hanover, was born. The Hanovers were Orthodox Jews, and it was a terribly difficult time to be an Orthodox Jew in Poland in the closing years of the 19th century. They were persecuted by the pogroms. The Tsar of Russia controlled Poland. Early after his tenure, he confiscated the property of Orthodox Jews in Poland, including all the property of the Hanover family. In 1893, Wolf Hanover, Joe's father, and the husband of Esther Hanover, decided he was going to find a new home somewhere on this earth for the Hanover family. And he actually left Esther, what a courageous woman, to be left behind there with her sons, with her 3 sons at the time, as he made the journey, promising her when he found the new home somewhere, he would send for Esther and the boys. Wolf Hanover made a treacherous journey out of Poland, got across the Baltic Sea to England, to London, to New York City through Ellis Island. In New York City, he then made a journey to St. Louis, Missouri, where he worked for a while as a peddler. And then he ended up in a place where I am, the town I'm in right now. He ended up in Memphis, Tennessee, a little community called Binghamton, Tennessee. He had a cousin in Memphis. And the cousin in Memphis, who had also come from Poland many years earlier, said, "This is a land of opportunity, a great place for opportunity. Come here." Wolf made his way to the Binghamton neighborhood just outside of Memphis. It was a separate community at the time. And there, he first worked as a peddler, using some of the materials, items that he got from his cousin David. And then he opened up his own dry goods store, which would eventually become W.C. Hanover and Sons. In 1895, Wolf Hanover had made enough money to get back to Esther in Pultusk, Poland, 4 steamship tickets, steerage steamship tickets to America, plus the sum of $500. And the sum of $500 was to pay a bootlegger to get Esther and the children out of Poland. Now, bootlegger didn't mean then what it means, particularly my part of the United States now. It wasn't somebody who got liquor. It was somebody who literally helped get people out. And young Joe Hanover's earliest memory, one of his earliest memories, when he was just 5 years old, was a memory, no vision, a memory of darkness and cold. Because you see, on a winter night in 1895, this bootlegger put young Joe Hanover in his knapsack and crossed a frozen lake in Poland with young Joe Hanover in the knapsack, in the darkness. Behind Joe and the bootleggers, behind the knapsack, was Esther holding the hands of her other 2 sons. She had a wig on. In her wig was a little bit of the cash that she had left over to somehow pay for the trip to America. They had the steerage tickets. And in her hose, she had a piece of salami, that piece of salami to feed her boys on that voyage. The bootlegger earned his $500. He got the family out of Poland, got them on board this steamship, and they began to make this treacherous journey to America. Esther and Joe and his brothers were all down in the bottom of this steerage class of this ship. Poor Esther was seasick most of the voyage. But one night when Esther was trying to sleep, or trying just to control her stomach, and the boys were sleeping, young Joe Hanover found his way to the top deck, to the first class portion there. There was an orchestra playing. And a big crowd there. And young Joe climbed up on the stage of the orchestra and began to dance for the crowd. They loved him. They threw money up on the stage. Joe scooped it up in his hat, took it back down to his mother. And when they got to through Ellis Island in New York, that money that Joe had collected helped pay for train tickets to Memphis, Tennessee, where they were reunited with Joe's father, Wolf Hanover, and found their new home in Binghamton, and where Joe began to work with his brothers and his father with W.C. Hanover and Sons Dry Goods. The Hanovers, Joe and Esther, became citizens of the United States in 1901. They were deeply patriotic about their new home. And these parents told Joe and his brothers, they said, "We're living in the greatest country on the face of the earth. There is no czar here to take away our property. We can worship where we choose to worship. And you boys need to understand your new home." Esther and Wolf encouraged the boys to read the American documents. They encouraged them to read the Constitution of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, and most importantly, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Young Joe read those documents. He read it by a kerosene lamp on the second floor above the dry goods store in the storefront they had on Broad Street in Binghamton. Joe was a bright young man, and he shared his parents' patriotism. But one night, Joe asked his parents a question. It was this question that is the title of the book. He said, "Why can't mother vote? You've both become citizens. Dad can vote, but mother can't vote. I don't understand why she is not afforded the right that the Bill of Rights says that Americans have." Well, he didn't get a direct answer from his parents. His parents just said, well, there are just certain things, and this is a great country. You should be very grateful. But Joe never forgot that question, and he began to address that question. And when I close my remarks to you in a few minutes, I'm going to tell you what Joe eventually said was the answer to the question. And I'm going to give you a little preface on this. It's an answer that was not only relevant 100 years ago in 1920, when Tennessee ratified the 19th Amendment. It is an answer that is very relevant today, almost 101 years later, when the fight for the vote goes on. But I'll get to that in a few minutes. Back to the story. Young Joe Hanover only went through the 8th grade in terms of his formal education. After the 8th grade, he began to work full-time at W.C. Hanover and Sons, because if you were a working class kid in the early 20th century in Memphis, Tennessee, you worked. That's what working class kids did. But as Joe got a little bit older, he began to go back to school at night. He went to night law school at the old Southern Law School in downtown Memphis. It later became the University of Memphis Law School, existing to this day, over a century later. Young Joe in law school fell in love with the law, fell in love with the rule of law, saw it as very much the cornerstone of democracy, deeply patriotic, and he was proud to become a lawyer. In 1914, Joe Hanover passed the Tennessee bar exam and got his first job as a lawyer as the city attorney for the little community of Binghamton, Tennessee, where his father had brought the family in 1895 to build their new life in their new home in the United States of America. In 1918, though, Joe decided he wanted to be not just a lawyer, but a lawmaker. In 1918, he ran for the Tennessee legislature. Now, I don't think there are any Tennesseans on this group, except a few people watching, but let me give you a little story about Tennessee politics then. There was a man in Memphis named E.H. Crump. He was known as Boss Crump because he was the political boss. And in Memphis in 1918, you couldn't be elected to anything, at least you didn't think you could be elected to anything, without being a Democrat and without being a Crump Democrat. And it was not only true in Memphis, it was true all over the state of Tennessee. He sort of picked out who was going to be governor, who was going to be senators. He had that power. Joe Hanover did not run in 1918 as a Democrat, and he certainly didn't run as a Crump Democrat. He ran as an independent. And he actually even said that he didn't have a lot of respect for Boss Crump. He actually said, my family and I, we Hanovers, we came to America from Poland to escape a tyrant, the Tsar of Russia. And Boss Crump is a tyrant in Memphis, Tennessee. Incredible. He actually said that. On election day, nobody expected Joe Hanover to be elected. Boss Crump didn't expect him to be elected, and Joe probably didn't expect to be elected. But he won. He won because there were so many immigrants in Binghamton, Tennessee, new citizens of this country, immigrants in the district number 5 of Shelby County, Tennessee, and they sent Joe to Nashville. Guess what Joe did in Nashville in January of 1919 when he arrived there? The first bill he introduced was a bill for partial suffrage. Partial suffrage. Now, at that time, people like Alice Paul, Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, they had kind of a two-pronged strategy to bring about the vote, to finally win the vote that the women should have had since the beginning of this republic. And the strategy was to go state by state, try to get some partial suffrage at least, so that women could vote in some elections, and that would increase the possibility of states ratifying a proposed constitutional amendment, which Alice Paul had proposed as early as 1910. And so Joe Hanover, remembering his promise to his mother and his question, he got partial suffrage through the Tennessee legislature in 1919. Didn't allow women to vote in all elections. It was almost, sadly, a separate but equal vote. They even voted by separate ballots from the men. But it was a first step. In the spring of 1919, the Tennessee legislature adjourned. In those days, the Tennessee legislature, I don't know about the New Jersey legislature, but in those days, the Tennessee legislature only met every other year. I'm going to make one political comment and I'll move on. I wish the Tennessee legislature were only meeting every other year now, but that's another topic for another time. But they only met every other year. So when they adjourned in the spring of 1919, Joe didn't anticipate coming back to Nashville for the legislature until 1921 at the earliest, if he was reelected in 1920. He went back to Memphis and got a new job. He got a plum job. He got a job as an assistant city attorney for the city of Memphis. How Boz Crump let that happen, I don't know, but he got that job. And not long after that, the Attorney General of Tennessee issued a ruling that Joe, by taking the job in Memphis, had forfeited his seat in the legislature. He cited a provision of the Tennessee Constitution that supposedly said you couldn't hold two paying government jobs at the same time. And Joe and three other members of the Tennessee legislature were held to have given up their legislative seats because they had other government paying jobs. Well, you know what Joe Hanover did when he heard about it? He ignored the Attorney General. He ignored the Attorney General. He didn't expect to go back for at least 2 more years. He loved his new job. There was no reason for him to worry about being a member of the legislature at that time. But then history began to happen. Woodrow Wilson, prompted finally by so many of the Alice Pauls picketing each day in front of the White House, all these efforts, finally in 1919 addressed Congress and said it's time to pass a resolution for a constitutional amendment granting women, winning for women, it's not a granting, but winning for women the right to vote that they should have had since the beginning of the Republic. And when they passed that, what happened was this. It began to go state by state. There were 48 states in the Union at that time, before Alaska, decades before Alaska and Hawaii. And so for the 19th Amendment to become the Constitution, part of the Constitution of the United States, 36 states had to pass it. And as Joe was working his new job in Memphis, he began to see history unveil across the country. The first week after Congress passed the Constitutional Amendment resolution, 8 states quickly passed it. It began to pass and began to march through the country, and it looked like that it was going to happen. And then in the winter of 1920 and the early spring of 1920, all that began to change. The governor of Louisiana made a speech to all of his fellow Southerners and said, we have to stop this. This is a white man's country. And if we let the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States pass, we know what's going to happen. It's not just going to be women that are going to be voting. We white men are going to lose our power if this happens. After the governor of Louisiana made that pronouncement, 7 southern states proceeded to reject the proposed 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. It began to stall in other states as well. Some states that had passed it, like Ohio, the legislature was reconvened to consider taking back their ratification. They had this disingenuous argument. They said, well, we're not opposed to women voting, but we just think that we should leave it up to the voters in the 1920 election when they elect a legislature to tell us whether they want legislators who support the 19th Amendment. In other words, they're saying we'll let the male voters decide whether we want the 19th Amendment. So it all began to unravel. By the early summer of 1920, with all the states lining up, it came down to 2 states. It came down to Delaware and Tennessee. In June of 1920, Delaware voted no. And now that 36th state, the state that could make this happen or stop it from happening, the 36th state was Tennessee. And Joe Hanover saw all this and knew that if there was a vote in the legislature, he wanted to be a part of that, to continue the work he had started with the passage of partial suffrage in 1919. In July of 1920, the governor of Tennessee, Governor Roberts, called a special session of the Tennessee legislature to consider the ratification of the 19th Amendment. In other words, to make it happen, to vote on whether to be the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And Joe wanted to be there. But you see, this Attorney General had issued an opinion that Joe wasn't even a member of the legislature anymore. In fact, the governor called for a special election in July of 1920 in Joe's old district and in 3 other districts in Tennessee whose legislators had also, quote, vacated their office. So he called a special election. And guess what Joe Hanover did? He stepped down from his position as an assistant city attorney in Memphis, Tennessee. He filed to run for the seat that he had been elected to in 1918. And that special election, the voters went to the polls. The voters in District Number 5 of Shelby County, Tennessee, went to the polls, and they sent Joe Hanover back to Nashville. In early August of 1920, Joe took a train from Memphis to Union Station in Nashville, Tennessee, checked into the Hermitage Hotel. If you're ever in Nashville, when this pandemic ends and we're all able to travel again, to go by the Hermitage, go by, because you see, to this day, it is decorated in honor of the events that occurred there in August of 1920. The Hermitage Hotel, the lobby of the Hermitage Hotel in August of 1920 was referred to as the third house of the Tennessee legislature. You had the Senate, you had the House of Representatives, and you had the Hermitage Hotel. You see, all the legislators, almost all of them, had checked in at the Hermitage Hotel where they like to stay. Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, had checked in with contacts with Alice Paul back in Washington, because she was there. She was there after this 70-plus year fight to see Tennessee pass it and see the 19th Amendment become part of the Constitution of the United States. The same day that she checked in, however, a woman from Mont Eagle, Tennessee, a woman named Josephine Anderson Pearson, also checked in. She was president of the Tennessee Association opposed to women's suffrage. She was a minister. She was an evangelical Christian minister who felt that giving the women votes would be contrary to Scripture, contrary to her interpretation of the Scripture, that the role of women, according to her reading of Paul and others in the Bible, is to be subservient to men. A little bit ironic that she's preaching about being subservient. She's doing a lot of talking for a subservient woman, but she came there to fight this. Guess who else came there? Lobbyists began to show up. Lobbyists for the L&N Railroad, the most powerful corporation in Tennessee at the time, opposed to the 19th Amendment. Some of you may have heard of an industry in Tennessee called Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels whiskey, bourbon. There was prohibition at the time, but you know something? Liquor flowed in Tennessee at the time. And the Jack Daniels people were also opposed for whatever reason. There was an unholy alliance between Josephine Pearson and the Women's Christian Temperance Union and Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels opened a Jack Daniels suite on the 8th floor of the Hermitage Hotel where legislators could go in the evening and retire and enjoy a little Jack Daniels and consider how they should vote about the proposed 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. At the start of this session, though, it was assumed that it was going to be a short session and that the 19th Amendment was going to pass. You see, the Tennessee State Senate, 28 members of the 32 had already pledged to vote for the proposed constitutional amendment. 62 members of the 99 members of the House had proposed to vote for it, had pledged to vote for it. It quickly passed the Senate by 28-4 vote. It was all coming down to the House where they had the pledge vote. And then all those lobbyists from the railroad, all those lobbyists from Jack Daniels, ministers, people across the state, began to lobby. And all of a sudden, those 62 pledge votes fell into the 50s. And then they fell from the 50s to 50. 50 votes was necessary to get this passed. And then it fell to 48. It was too votes short. One evening, Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, summoned Joe Hanover to her suite in the Hermitage Hotel. She looked at Joe Hanover and said, "We're losing this battle, and I want you to lead the legislative fight." Joe Hanover was frankly surprised at the request. And on the surface of it, it didn't seem to make a lot of political sense. First of all, Joe was the only independent in the Tennessee legislature that was overwhelmingly controlled by Democrats. He was one of only 2 Jewish members of the Tennessee legislature. He was from Memphis. He was from the largest city in the state. He was a city boy. He was a city boy lawyer in an overwhelmingly rural legislature. But Carrie Chapman Catt knew 2 things about Joe Hanover. First of all, she knew that there was not any member of the Tennessee legislature more committed to women's suffrage than Joe Hanover. He had fought for it from the day he first arrived in Nashville. It was the reason he actually believed he ran to be in the Tennessee legislature and why he ran a second time to be in the Tennessee legislature. He was dedicated to this. He was the suffragent supporting the suffragists. But she knew something else about him too. You see, Joe Hanover was maybe the most respected member of the Tennessee legislature for some of the very reasons that it didn't make a lot of political sense that she was asking him to lead the fight. He was the only independent. He was respected on both sides of the aisle. And during the brief time he had been in the legislature, he was one of the few lawyers in the legislature at the time, the word got out among his fellow legislators that if you want a bill written, you want a resolution written, you want it done right, go see Joe Hanover from Memphis. He'll do it for you. He did it. He did it for Democrats. He did it for Republicans. He did it and won overwhelming respect. And so Joe Hanover said, "I'll agree to lead this fight." I want to tell you, it almost cost him his life. It literally almost cost him his life. When the word got out that Joe Hanover was going to lead the fight for the ratification of the 19th Amendment, that evening he was in the elevator at the Hermitage Hotel. He was attacked by 2 men. One man called him, I'm going to just tell you what he said, called him a kike. The other man called him a Bolshevik. They beat him. He survived the attack. The next day, the governor of Tennessee appointed him a bodyguard from the Captain Paul Bush from the Nashville police force. Joe said, "I don't need a bodyguard." And Governor Roberts said, "Yes, you do, Joe, and you're going to have a bodyguard." And that bodyguard accompanied Joe for the rest of the session. Joe lost weight. He developed an ulcer. He couldn't sleep at night. The room and his phone rang at all hours, sometimes from men threatening him, other times from the voices of women who claimed they wanted to come by his room and help him work on the passage of women's suffrage. And Joe saw a trap there and didn't fall into that trap. He began to work very hard with all these rural legislators that respected him, worked very, very hard, but he was in an uphill battle. One thing that was happening was there was bribery taking place. The Illinois Railroad had a lot of money. The lobbyists had a lot of money. Joe didn't have money for bribes, but he was a man of honor, and he wouldn't have bribed anybody for the vote if he had the money. One day, one of his fellow legislators from the mountains of East Tennessee came to see him, and he said, "Joe, I know I promised you that I was going to vote for women's suffrage, but Joe, I got to tell you, I got to vote no. The aunties are offering me $500 for my vote." And Joe looked at him and he said, "They are taking you for a ride, buddy. The going rate is $1,000. And the mountain legislator said, "Oh, Joe, that's terrible. I'm with you, Joe," and stayed with him. Joe kept working and kept working very, very hard. Now, you've probably noticed something. You noticed that today I'm wearing a yellow rose. And probably many of you know the story about the Battle of the Roses, and you know why I'm wearing a yellow rose. You see, the symbol of the suffs, the symbol of the men, of the women, and their male supporters, that one of the passages of the 19th Amendment was a yellow rose, The aunties had a red rose. And on the floor of the legislature in August of 1920, you had legislators wearing yellow roses. You had legislators wearing red roses. And this may surprise you. You had a few that actually wore both of them side by side, as they tried to straddle the florid fence. In the gallery of the legislature, as the proposed 19th Amendment ratification was debated, there were viewers wearing the yellow roses, viewers wearing the red roses. On August 17th, 1920, the final debate took place on the floor of the Tennessee House of Representatives. It literally came down to the Tennessee House of Representatives whether the 19th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States was going to be ratified and become the law of the land. On that day, August 17th, the final debate took place on the floor of the legislature. Seth Walker, who was the Speaker of the Tennessee legislature, the most powerful member of the Tennessee legislature, although he had supported partial suffrage in 1919, had made a turn. He bought the argument about it being a white man's country and what was at stake. And Seth Walker began to lead the fight against the ratification. On August 17th, in the final debate, Seth Walker handed his gavel over to the Speaker pro tem of the Tennessee House of Representatives so he could take the well of the Tennessee House and make his speech. He got up that day in the well of the House and held up a telegram in his hand and read the telegram to the members of the Tennessee legislature. The telegram was from the, quote, colored lady voters of Los Angeles. And the colored lady voters of Los Angeles urged the Tennessee legislature to ratify the 19th Amendment, making it the law of the land, so that they could vote as well. And Seth Walker said, I've been warning you about this. This is exactly what I feared might happen. We must stop this, and we must stop it now. And then it came time for the final voice to be heard on the floor of the Tennessee legislature. And that was the voice of Joe Hanover, from Pawtusk, Poland, to Binghamton, Tennessee, to Memphis, Tennessee, to now finally on the floor of the legislature. And this is what Joe Hanover did that day. Now, I'm a lawyer. I'm proud to be a lawyer. And one of the things I think we lawyers are pretty good at is we can tell a story. We tell stories to try to move juries. We tell stories to try to move judges. You know, you can cite laws, you can cite statutes, you can do all these things. But in the final analysis, what a good lawyer really does is he tells a story that moves people. Joe Hanover that day told his story. He told his fellow members of the legislature about making that journey across a frozen lake in Poland as a little boy, of coming into America. And then he looked at the legislators and he said, you know, my story may be different in some respects, but it is not unique. We have all crossed the seas to be here today. It may not have been you like me who crossed the seas. It may have been your grandparents, whoever. We all crossed the seas to be here today. He said, we have a chance now to make democracy real, to make democracy real by ratifying the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and giving our mothers and our sisters and our daughters what they should have had from the beginning of this republic, winning the right to vote. And then the legislature recessed for the day with the vote to come the next day. Joe spent that evening frantically trying to change votes. He couldn't change votes. They were still 2 votes short. Late that night, Carrie Chapman Catt summoned the supporting legislators to her suite in the Hermitage Hotel. And she said, we've done our last canvass. We're 2 votes short. And she said, I don't know what else we can do except pray. And they did pray. The next morning, August 18th, 1920, Joe Hanover walked through the lobby of the Hermitage Hotel to the cheers and jeers of a crowd. The Nashville police estimated that there were 40,000 people around the Hermitage to the Capitol just a block away that day for this vote. Joe was cheered by the yellow rose wearing supporters, and he was jeered by the red rose wearing suffs. And he and Captain Paul Bush made their way to the Capitol. Joe Hanover realizing that we may be 2 votes short. Seth Walker called the session into order. He once again did what he did the previous day. He handed the gavel over to the Speaker pro tem so that he could take the well of the House And he said, quote, "The hour has come. It's time to vote. I move to table the resolution in support of the proposed 19th Amendment." Now, most of us with any parliamentary procedure experience know what that means. Table means to kill it. Table means to stop it right there. They were disingenuous about it. Again, they were raising this argument. Well, it doesn't mean it's going to end it. It just means that this fall, the voters will get to tell us whether they want this. The male voters in Tennessee will get to tell us whether they want this. But he said, "I move to table." And they began to call the roll. As they called the roll of voices, it seemed to be going all according to Hoyle, as they say. No big surprises. The legislators wearing the yellow roses voted against the motion to table. The legislators wearing the red roses voted in favor of the motion to table. And then they came to the name of Banks Turner. Banks Turner was from Paris, Tennessee, a farmer. He was wearing a red rose. He was known to be an opponent of the proposed 19th Amendment. But when they called his name on the motion to table, Banks Turner voted no. He voted against the motion to table. The crowd was surprised. Seth Walker, the speaker, was surprised. Seth Walker was convinced that Banks Turner was just confused. He walked up to his desk on the floor, put his hand on his shoulder, and just knew that there was just a mistake there. When they cast all the votes, because Banks Turner had cast his vote on the motion to table was tied. That one vote change had tied it. It fell one vote short. Banks Turner had kept it alive. But Seth Walker knew they still can't win. They're at least one vote short. They're probably two votes short. So he said, "I call the question." And they began to call the roll for the second time that day. One of the first names they called in the B's, alphabetical order, was Harry Byrne of Nyota, Tennessee, a telegraph operator in Nyota, Tennessee, wearing a red rose, known to be an opponent of the proposed ratification of the 19th Amendment. And for the second surprise that day, the gallery, Seth Walker, everybody heard a red rose wearing legislator passed a vote they didn't expect. Harry Byrne said, "I vote aye." Seth Walker was just convinced that, like poor Banks Turner, he just got confused. He just made a mistake. And he began to walk around the floor, glared at Harry Byrne, kind of nodded like, "I know we'll take care of this." And they kept calling the rolls. And then for the second time that day, they called the name Banks Turner. And guess what Banks Turner did, even wearing a red rose? Banks Turner voted aye. And when all the votes were cast, a gasp went up from the crowd. The women in the gallery began to throw the petals of the yellow roses like confetti. It had passed. It had passed 49 to 48. Seth Walker demanded another vote. It passed again, 49 to 48. Joe Hanover was mobbed like a winning pitcher in a World Series, Game 7 in a World Series baseball game. Harry Byrne escaped through an anteroom because there was genuine fear about his safety. It had passed. And then Seth Walker was just too clever by half. He decided to make another parliamentary move. He stood up and he said, "I wish to change my vote from proposing the ratification to supporting it." And you know why he did it? Again, parliamentary procedure. If you're going to have a motion to reconsider, you have to be in the group. You have to be in the group that voted in favor of it. So he planned on coming back with a motion to reconsider. But what Seth Walker had not realized was this. He just cast the 50th vote. It wasn't 49 votes for it anymore. It was 50. That made a legal challenge to a parliamentary majority much more difficult. And he had cast that vote. That night, Seth Walker and the antis decided to, no pun intended, up the ante once again. They confronted Joe Hanover and Harry Byrne with an affidavit signed by a witness that claimed she had witnessed Joe Hanover offering a bribe of $10,000 to Harry Byrne for his vote. Harry Byrne and Joe Hanover said, "It's a lie. It's an absolute lie." Now, what these antis didn't know was, yes, they had an affidavit. Yes, it had been signed. Yes, it had been notarized as the statement was sworn to, but the notary public that had notarized it was, in fact, for women's suffrage. She wasn't wearing a yellow rose during the whole thing, but she heard it. And she actually heard the whole story about how they made this up. The affidavit was false. The affidavit was a lie. And guess what happened? The two newspapers in Nashville got the story. And the next morning, there wasn't just the story of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, but the story about how the antis had tried with a false affidavit to accuse and to slander Joe Hanover and Harry Byrne. There were more parliamentary moves. Some of the antis actually tried to leave. They got on something called the Red Rose Express and fled to Decatur, Alabama, trying to escape there, trying to claim that it hadn't passed. But the problem was when Seth Walker the next day had his motion to reconsider, there were still enough voters there for over 50 to be there, and the supporters voted down the motion to reconsider. That day, Carrie Chapman Catt, Sue Shelton White, other great Tennessee women who supported the amendment, got on a train to make the trip to Washington, D.C., where they would see the Secretary of State sign the 19th Amendment into the Constitution of the United States. It was a circuitous route they had to take. They went from Nashville to Chattanooga to Atlanta. It took a number of days to go back up the eastern seaboard. They actually arrived about 3 hours after the Secretary of State had signed it into law. But they went by the office of the President of the United States, Alice Paul, and they met with Woodrow Wilson and thanked him for his support that, thanks to Alice Paul, finally happened. What did Joe Hanover do? Joe Hanover took the train back to Memphis. He never returned to Nashville. He never ran for public office again. You see, he had accomplished what he ran for the legislature to do. Why can't mother vote? He had helped deliver that. For the next 70 years, Joe Hanover, until his passing in 1984, practiced law in Memphis, Tennessee. He married a wonderful woman named Jean Kaplan, and he and Jean were kindred spirits. They loved horses. They raised thoroughbred horses on a horse farm out in Germantown, Tennessee. They named their horses after their best friends. They ran the horses in the Preakness in many races. And their all-time favorite horse was named Danny T. Danny T won the Arkansas Derby, the biggest victory that Joe Hanover ever experienced. Guess who Danny T was named after? He was named after Joe Hanover's dear friend, Danny Thomas, the entertainer who was the founder of the St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, just a few miles from where I'm sitting right now, where children are being treated and cured and cared for to this day. I want to finish my remarks by the second part of this, the answer to the question, why can't mother vote? And this little subtitle of the book, Joseph Hanover and the Unfinished Business of Democracy. You see, Joe Hanover, later in life, in an interview, was asked about the whole issue of why can't mother vote and what he learned. He said, I became a lawyer. I practiced law. I got into politics. I worked in many, many areas. And over time, I came to a realization. And the realization is democracy is a work in progress. In August of 1920, there was unfinished business of democracy. That unfinished business was the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And this is why this story is relevant today. Nearly 101 years later, there is still unfinished business in democracy. I know we're all aware of that. Watch the news tonight, read the newspapers, read the stories of the continuing fight for the vote all over the United States of America. Because you see, Joe Hanover was right. There is unfinished business to democracy, and we still need to address that business today. Thank you for letting me share to the Alice Paul Institute. What a thrill. Thank you for letting me share this story of Joe Hanover.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was fantastic. That was fantastic. This is the third time I have heard you tell that story, and I still get chills. I find it so riveting. And there's so many things about this story I love. As a descendant of Ukrainian Jews who came to the United States fleeing pogroms, I love hearing the story of someone with a similar background, in some ways, fighting so hard for justice in America. And I think it's so important to tell stories of allies. And I love the way that you bring him so alive when you tell this story. And as you pointed out, there's so many relevant themes to our current political moment. And so I have a few questions that have popped up in the Q&A, and I don't know if you know this one, but someone pointed out that Hanover's a German name. And if you know if that was his family name or if it was changed when they came over.
This is a mystery, and I should know the answer, and I don't know and I've tried to find the answer to this question. Joe Hanover and Jean Kaplan Hanover did not have children. They had nephews and nieces. A few of them are with us today. And I've tried to get the answer to that question, and I apologize that I don't have the answer to that question. If I ever get to write a sequel, maybe I'll get another edition. Maybe I'll get an answer to that. I'm embarrassed I don't know the answer, but I've honestly tried to get the answer.
That's so interesting. Someone's just asking if you have that rose clipped on, or if it's tucked into your button there.
My 21st century suffragist wife, Claudia, pinned it on a while ago. It's just pinned on, and I love wearing the yellow rose. I really do. I was telling Elisa earlier, when the book first came out in January of last year, before the pandemic made all these events Zoom and all, I was on a TV talk show, and one of those coffee talk shows, about the book. And I wore the yellow rose, and I never mentioned why I was wearing it. And the interviewer never asked me about it. When it was over, I got some emails of what was the yellow rose. Now, a lot of the viewers knew what it was about, but I wish I had said something. But anyway. Very pretty. It's very attractive, don't you think?
I think it's lovely. I'm a big fan of the corsage and boutonniere. So I'm wondering, how did you encounter Joseph Hanover? Why did you write this book?
That's a wonderful question. And I want to tell you this, it was not my idea. I mentioned Paula Casey earlier, who published this wonderful book, The Perfect 36, that was written by the late Carol Lynn Yellen and Dr. Jan Ann Sherman. Carol Lynn Yellen was a wonderful historian who we lost a number of years ago. I say in my preface to the book that if Carol Lynn Yellen were with us today, she would have written this book. But what happened was the last book I wrote was about another great woman named Pat Summitt, the great women's basketball coach at the University of Tennessee. And I was having a signing at a bookstore in Memphis a few years back with that book. And my dear friend Paula Casey and Jossie Wurzburg, I think they're both watching this today, two 21st century suffragists. And they came up to me, and it was I'll never forget this. They said, "We know what your next book is going to be." And I said, "Well, that's interesting because I have no idea. Tell me." And they said, "You need to write the story of Joe Hanover. Somebody needs to write Joe Hanover's story." I called Elaine Weiss. Many of you have read The Woman's Hour. Fantastic book. And I talked to her and met her through this. And I said, I'm almost intimidated after what you wrote. I'm almost intimidated to write the story of Joe Hanover. And I was so honored. She wrote a wonderful endorsement for the book. And she said, somebody needs to write his story. He's the unsung hero, suffragette on this. He died in 1984. I never met him, but I will tell you this. I spent a couple of years of my life reading his letters, talking to lawyers who had practiced with him at one time, talking to his nephew, Eddie Kaplan, and I began to call him Uncle Joe. I felt like I knew him. And I will say this, I'll give you a plug for writing a biography. When you write a biography of someone, you get to know somebody. You really do. And if there's somebody who's still with us, you can meet with them and talk with them. And if they pass like Uncle Joe has, you still meet them. You still spend a lot of time. There's a wonderful synagogue in Memphis, Temple Israel, and Micah Greenstein, the incredible senior rabbi of Temple Israel. He was a major source for this book because I called Micah. I said, I'm writing a book about Joe Hanover. I said, I understand you kind of have a history of all these great Jewish families in Memphis, He said, I'll call you back. A couple days later, he said, Jennifer Koloff's our synagogue librarian. Come out here. There was a conference room with papers from Joe Hanover and the Hanover family and newspaper clippings. I like to tell you, I did all the research for this book, but Temple Israel and Micah Greenstein did an enormous amount of research for the book. But that's a long-winded answer to your question.
On the back of the book, because I have a copy, I noticed there's a bust of Joe Hanover. Is that in the Tennessee Statehouse?
No, this is very exciting. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned this. I mentioned Paula Casey earlier, the founder of the Tennessee Women's Suffrage Heritage Trail. There are monuments going around across the state of Tennessee, from Knoxville and the Smoky Mountains all the way across Nashville, Centennial Park, all these communities around the state. And there will soon be, within the next few weeks, in Memphis, Tennessee, facing the Mississippi River, behind the University of Memphis Law School, the Equality Trailblazers Memphis Suffrage Monument. This is the bust of one of the men being honored, of a suffragette being honored there. I write in my book, the final chapter is called Joe Hanover Returns to Memphis, because very soon he will be facing the Mississippi River. He loved the Mississippi River. He was chairman of the Mississippi River Port Commission. Loved the Mississippi River. And he and his suffrage sisters, several of them, will be in bust facing the Mississippi River behind the law school. I'm thrilled for the law students that they will have this there, because you talk about somebody who personified the rule of law in making democracy real. So you're right. The bust heaven's on the back, and come to Memphis in a few months, and when you can travel, and you can meet Joe Hanover down by the Mississippi River.
We had just, one of our guests, Joanne, had just asked about Joe Hanover and what kind of historic preservation efforts were happening around him. So that is.
I apologize. I mean, there's one more too. The Hanover home on Broad Street in Binghamton is now a wonderful restaurant called Bounty on Broad. We rolled the book out there, which was very nice, very nice. And there's going to be a monument, a sidewalk monument there as well. So you can see, and you will literally be standing in front of the building where on the second floor in the early years of the 20th century, he asked the question, why can't mother vote?
Oh, that's amazing. We have a great love, obviously, of historic houses here at API. I'm not at Paulsdale right now, but hopefully all of you can come join us there. So before we get to our last few questions, I want to ask, how can people get this book? We have a lot of people commenting that they want it. So what's the best place to buy it?
I appreciate that very much. Of course, it is available online, Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble carries it. I don't know about the bookstores in your area. Now, we'll tell you this, and this is blatant self-promotion, okay? But you can rather than my website, which is billhaltom.com, you can check that. But if you just go to Haltom, WHALTOM at Comcast.net, and tell me how you would like the book inscribed and your address, and I'll get you a copy of the book. And the Perfect 36 is also available online. But thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's always nice. One of my goals as a writer once, this is my 8th book, and one of my goals as a writer once was to have people who didn't even know me buy copies of my book. So I'm trying to accomplish that.
Well, I think you're going to get a few. Little marks in that goal today. If you want to buy from an independent bookseller, bookshop.org, which will source it through your local bookstores, does have it on their website. I just checked.
Thank you very much.
So there was a question about why Harry Byrne is given credit, why everyone knows, everyone who knows the suffrage story knows Harry Byrne, but Joe Hanover isn't such a popular name. Well,
and I apologize. At least I think I actually did not mention, I'm sorry. I think I just made an oversight. I didn't mention the rest of the Banks Turner and Harry Byrne story, why they cast their surprise vote. Banks Turner had actually, the day of the vote, had been summoned by Governor Roberts of Tennessee to his office that morning, where he was having a phone conversation with Governor Cox of Ohio, who was the Democratic nominee for president of the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the candidate for vice president of the United States. And Cox had called the governor of Tennessee and said, you got to get this passed, because there are literally millions of votes on the line. Banks Turner had been summoned to the governor's office by the Tennessee governor, and on the other side of the conversation, he tells the governor of Ohio, the man who's going to make this happen is sitting across from me right now. The Harry Burns story, and I apologize, I think many people know this story. Yes, he had a red rose on. Under his lapel, under the red rose, was a note from his mother, Phoebe Burns, in Nyota, Tennessee. And Phoebe Burns said, be a good boy, support Mrs. Catt, and vote for women's suffrage. And Harry Burns said, I'm a good boy. I always do what my mother asked me to do. The short answer to that question, I apologize. I apologize. What a big omission, and I apologize. The short answer to that question is this. Let's be candid about this. Harry Burns' note from his mother is a made-for-TV, a made-for-movie moment. It's just a made-for-movie moment. I mean, it's a great story. And the Joe Hanover story is a little more nuanced, okay? It was a story of organizing. It was a story of working diligently, day and night, working for years on this. So it doesn't quite have the made-for-TV moment on it. But the truth of the matter is that the Harry Burns story is a great story. And my friend Tyler Boyd, the great nephew of Harry Burns, has also written a book about him, which you can find online. We've done some programs together. But the truth of the matter is, even with that note from his mother in his pocket, he would not have been able to cast that vote that day were it not for Joe Hanover. Because Joe Hanover got those 48 and then 49 votes together. He got those votes together. So that's the Harry Burns story is a great story. I love this story myself. I do wish that Joe would get a little more attention. I'm trying to do that.
I think that points to such an important just an important thing to remember about the way Americans remember history. We love dramatic, showy moments. We love talking about, I mean, we don't love, but when we talk about like the suffrage story, we talk about the parade in 1913, we talk about the Night of Terror in 1917, and those are very important moments to remember. But it was a 72-year-long struggle. And it took, like, most of what Alice Paul did was boring. She lobbied.
No question.
She organized, she lobbied, she made phone calls, she wrote letters. And that's not super dramatic. But it's so important because I think we see so many people get burnt out on activism today, young people and people my age and younger, because they don't see immediate results. They say, I went to a protest and nothing changed. Yeah. You know, I organized a march, I wrote a letter, I called my senator, nothing changed. But things don't change overnight. They take long, boring organizing slogs.
That's an excellent point. Even after the passage of the 19th Amendment, it wasn't until 1965 that the Voting Rights Act passed. It was decades after that. The Equal Rights Amendment was originally proposed by Alice Paul and has not happened to this day. So, you know, you're exactly right. Mother Teresa once said, we can't do great things. We can only do small things. When we do small things, great things happen, you know. And I really believe that, you know, right now, I think one thing we can all do, I think we can all help get people to register to vote. Get people, and also, this is important too, and I have this own issue with family members and friends. A lot of people register to vote and they don't vote in state legislative elections. They vote in national elections. And I truly believe that some of our state legislatures aren't truly representative of people in this country, because if only 2,000 or 3,000 people vote in a state, which is often the case, that's who the people that go to the state capitals, and some of them are trying to suppress the vote. So I think you're absolutely right, and I think the most important thing is to keep working on the unfinished business of democracy.
So I'm going to make a plug for a different book to you and to everyone. Someone just commented that if you haven't read it, Alice Paul Claiming Power by J.D. Zahniser, I have a copy right here on my desk because I reference it so frequently, is an amazing book about Alice and her suffrage and the suffrage struggle in her life. So if you haven't read it, it's a great read. If you're an audiobook person, J.D. Zahniser reads it herself and is a great reader. So I think we are about out of time, but one more time, someone has asked for your website. I don't know if if Tane, who's doing our kind of backstage management can type this up for everyone, but can you just say your website? Just
Well,
spell it out one more.
the website is, I worked long and hard to come up with this title. It's billhaltom.com, www.billhaltom.com. My email address, if you want to get a personalized copy of the book, is whaltom@comcast.net. I do make house calls, but it would be a long drive to a lot of places, you know.
So you will all be getting an email asking you to give us feedback on this program. We will make sure to pop in that email just Bill's email address and website so that everyone can be sure to see it. And with that, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Bill. It's been such a pleasure. And thank you, everyone.
A real thrill to speak to the Alice Paul Institute program. A real thrill. Thank you so much.
And for everyone who wants to continue having conversations about the unfinished business of democracy, on Thursday, April 15th, just coming up next week, we have Susan Philpott, who is a ranger with the National Park Service at the Belmont Paul House in DC, coming to do a talk about the Equal Rights Amendment, its history, its current state, and that's going to be a conversation based event. So we would love to see all of you there. All right. Have a fantastic afternoon.